Good evening and welcome. It is exactly 7 o'clock, and we know that because Tracy Halverson is just walking through the door. How are you, Tracy? Tracy is the person that does our online streaming for us for these events at Center for Faith Studies. And that's one of the things I wanted to let you know. We do live stream these, and that means you can watch it at home for free, which means that we doubly appreciate the fact that you're here and that you paid to be here, because that helps supports everything that we do here at Countryside. We are underwritten by the Sherwood Foundation, which we are awesomely pleased with, but your support for our work here is doubly appreciated, because it's also your voice and your conversation in the community that means so much to us. The point of doing Center for Faith Studies events is to start conversation. And if people aren't here to begin those conversations and talk to one another, it's really hard to do that kind of ministry. So having you here with us is a great thing. But if for some reason you find that you're at home and can't get here, we do live stream our events. So thank you very much for being here. We have an extra special guest tonight, and I can't wait to get started on her program. But we have some housekeeping things I'd like to get started with. First of all, I'm Chris Alexander. For those of you who don't know me, I'm the Associate Pastor here at Countryside. I'm also the Director of Center for Faith Studies. This is a wonderful ministry that I'm so proud to be a part of. We have events that happen usually 6 to 8 times per year, program year, and we have a terrific lineup this year that starts in the conversation of inclusion and diversity, and starting those conversations about why diversity is so important for us to be united. The united around diversity is kind of the key to be able to honor each other's differences as well as things that we have in common. So that's the conversation this year, and we'd love to get started with Kimberly. I'm so excited that you're here. Our housekeeping things include things like, if you have a cell phone, please turn those off right now. That would be terrific. Or on stun, as Eric Elness always says. Just on silent, that would be great. We have restrooms that are just outside the sanctuary to your left. At the end of the hallway, you turn left again, and the restrooms are right there. You are free to leave the sanctuary anytime you want to go grab water or to run to the restroom. There is water and cookies and coffee for afterwards in what we call the Common Grounds coffee houses, just to the left as you exit the sanctuary. And we have some fabulous high-B cookies. I know you're all jonesing for those, right? You all want those? So, but what it does do is it gives us a chance to sit around and talk to each other about what we just heard, as well as get to know people that you have not met before, and maybe give you a chance to talk to Kimberly one-on-one as well. So I would invite you all to allow Kimberly to exit first and get on out there and get her cup of coffee or her glass of water, and then she'll be there and available for conversation afterwards. Sound good? Okay, I'd also like to recognize all the volunteers who are here with us tonight. Center for Faith Studies has an awesome group of volunteers who are incredibly loyal, like Tracy, who comes in every time to do our online. Thank you so much. She'll have Q&A questions as well. If you are at home and are our online folks, please know that you are invited to be with us in the question and answer. All you have to do is type your question in to the chat room, and Tracy will translate it here for us, and you'll be able to answer in live time. And all of you, any questions that you have, there will be time afterwards for question and answer. So we appreciate that you keep all of those question and answer period things to questions and not necessarily comments. You can talk to Kimberly about that afterwards, but if you would keep the question and answer period questions, that would be terrific. Okay, I think we're ready to go. Oh, also just wanted you to know that this is the kickoff of the Center for Faith Studies events that are happening for this program year. And our next event is Dr. Joe Starita, who is working with his work with Dr. Susan Flesch, who is a Native American doctor. And so the whole Native American conversation, as well as the whole gender bias that goes with that, is the diversity that we will be talking about next month. And it's Thursday night September 27th, and there's advertisements out on the tables out there, so you'll get more information. If you are not on our sign-up list for email events and prompts, please let me know, and we'll make sure that you get on our list where you can get tickets online and all that kind of stuff too. Okay? All right, on to Kimberly. Kimberly is an Omaha native. How many of you knew her when she was here in school? Yes, she was talked up so much by Deb McAllister as being one of the greatest people from Westside High School to ever graduate that has done some tremendous, amazing things. And she has, as you can read in her bio, the places that she lived, the people that she's talked to, an astounding career for someone quite young as you. It's an amazing thing. It's wonderful. And what I think even more so than all of the degrees that she's acquired, all of the experience that she has acquired overseas, all of the conversations she has with politics and government, and that alone is an astounding thing, is her generosity. She uses this time for free for people to come speak to these issues of diversity and what it means to be culturally literate and able to talk to people of other cultures without having any kind of judgments or just to have a nice opening to learn something new. And she gives up her time to be able to do that. And that is something that I think is astounding. And she has volunteered her time to be with us tonight, and I'll let her get started on it. But Kimberly, please come forward. And this is for you, thanking you for coming to be with us tonight.
It's very sweet, I appreciate it.
You can get started.
So thank you for everyone for coming tonight. Is this too loud, not loud enough? Okay. All right. I will try to avoid some of the direct sunlight coming in at the end of the day, but I want to say it's such a pleasure to be here. I was actually confirmed here in this sanctuary when I was 14 years old, so it's special for me to be back here at Countryside Community Church. And when I was in town, the last time I was in town, I had an opportunity to talk to Deb McAllister, who's sitting over here, who actually gave me my first ever real job here in Omaha. And she was telling me about the Tri-Faith Initiative, and we were thinking, well, maybe there's some interesting synergies here, because what does a diplomat and the Tri-Faith Initiative have in common? And really, it's a very similar mission, which is we are each trying to build cultural awareness and then bridge some of those cultural differences, building bridges between people. And that's a lot of what I do when I'm overseas representing the US government. So what we thought we'd do is tonight, I have a bit of a structured presentation, but you are very welcome to ask questions throughout. I like it to be also a little bit of a discussion. And we'll talk a little bit about some of the things that frame our own cultural perspective, things that we might not even realize are so integrated into like what we think and what we expect and what we do, but building that awareness is part of interacting with other cultures that may in fact not have that same kind of cultural anchoring. And so I hope you can see some of the slides. They're kind of meant to be a framework, like I said, for discussion. I would like to know, just before we start, I like to have an idea of my audience. How many people have actually then traveled overseas and been in another country? So pretty much everybody here. Okay, how many of you have been to Africa? All right, a handful there. Asia? Asia, looks like a lot of folks. How about the Middle East? A little bit fewer, but we've got a few. Okay, Latin America? Okay, so we've got quite a section of people who have been various places in the world. This presentation actually draws from different cultural issues from different parts of the world, so it'll be kind of interesting to see the parts that are familiar to those who've already traveled and experienced some of that. So we just want to start off with, what does culture mean to you? When we're talking about culture, there are things that are very visible signs of culture and things that are less visible signs of culture. So a lot of times when we're talking about it in the State Department, which is what I do, and we teach foreign affairs, we describe culture as an iceberg. There is a whole part at the top that's visible that we all see and we're all aware of. And then there's an underlying largely a much larger part of the culture, which is more anchored in your beliefs, your expectations, perhaps religion and some other things that might be less visible, but really are rooted in how people interact. And so we're going to talk a little bit more about that sort of unseen lower elements of the iceberg today. So when we talk about culture, above the surface, some of the things that you may see: food, music, art, how people dress, their clothing, or holiday customs. Those are things that you see and that are very obvious when you're looking through the lens at another culture. But below the surface, you also have quite a number of things, including social etiquette, work ethics, concepts of beauty, notions of modesty, your concept of self and general worldview. And that's the less visible part. So when we're talking about developing cultural awareness, what we're really talking about is informing people, learning some of the cultural competencies of either domestically or abroad so that you can facilitate communication. And the point that we always stress in the Foreign Service is, remember, what's normal in our culture may not be normal in another culture. So we're going to have a little quiz, and I would like people to participate. Just raise your hands. I have a few questions I'm going to ask, and they relate to different parts of the world. So first question is, in what country is it considered a compliment to slurp loudly while eating soup? And your choices are Iceland, Russia, Japan, or Colombia. Japan. Lots of people seem to be in agreement on that. Yep. And the answer is Japan. In many Asian cultures, slurping is a sign that you appreciate the food. And this is something that, again, coming from an American cultural mindset where we're sort of taught not to do that. Here's another question. You're in Amman, Jordan, and you are invited to go to the souk. Where will you be going? Would you be going to the mosque, a market, a park, or a Turkish bath? I hear park. I hear market. Anything else? Nope. In the Arab world, a souk is a market. So, good answer. Question number 3. In Italy and France, mums are the favored flowers to take when you're invited to dinner at someone's house. True or false? Any intrepid folks want to make a guess on that one? False. You would say false? Any idea why? Because they're a funeral flower. Good answer. In Italy and France, mums are funeral flowers linked to All Souls Day, November 2nd. And this is quite interesting because flowers, the number of flowers, the types of flowers, the colors of flowers can have very strong cultural significance in different countries. For example, in Italy, roses should not be given in an even number because that is also a sign of mourning. So we all think a dozen roses would be a great idea, but maybe not in another culture. And this particular one kind of came home to me. I was a student in France in the 1980s, and in the fall we started seeing these beautiful mums that were all in the flower shops. So all of us who were students there started buying them and taking them to our host families as a gesture of appreciation for the fact that they had invited us to dinner. And it wasn't until a little bit later that someone pointed out that we were all giving them death flowers. So I learned that particular lesson the hard way. Okay, if you're having dinner with a business partner in Argentina, when is it appropriate to talk business? As soon as you sit down to the table, after some polite table conversation, after the meal is finished, or never? Any thoughts? Educated guesses are perfectly acceptable. You say C, after the meal is finished. Anything else? Never? Okay. After some polite table conversation. In Argentina, relationships are important, so you have to begin with a table conversation before beginning to discuss business matters in earnest. This is something that's actually very different from an American cultural approach to things. We're very direct, we sit down, we want to get to business. When I was in the Middle East the first time, in Egypt, I was in the Sinai Desert. I was part of a peacekeeping mission where we would travel around to monitor the peace agreement between Israel and Egypt. So we would actually go to different military bases and count tanks and count artillery to make sure that each side was abiding by the limits of the treaty. And so here you think you're on a military, quasi-military style mission, but every base we would go to before we could get to what we were doing, we always had to sit down with the commander and have tea. And that was a very important sign of hospitality in the Middle East, and it's very important for us not to offend our hosts by saying, oh, we're really late, we need to get through, thank you for the tea and all, but we want to finish our mission, get home before dark. Like, you just don't do that. So that kind of hospitality and that relationship building is really important in many cultures. Question 5. In which country would showing up half an hour late for an invitation be considered rude? Greece, Switzerland, Panama, or Guinea? Most people are going to think Switzerland, right? And you're right. There's a reason they have watches invented in Switzerland. Attitudes to time can really differ greatly between one country and another, and that's very significant when you go to another country to learn whether it's rude to show up early, rude to show up late. A lot of times this carries over also into social aspects of life. And again, first time I was in France and got invited to a party, and they said the party started at 8. Now, if you're invited to a party that starts at 8 here in Omaha, what time would you show up? 7:45, right? Yeah, so you show up close to on time, right? Yeah, well, we showed up and the hostess wasn't dressed, the food wasn't ready, and most of the other guests showed up around 10. So we had a lot of quality time on the couch with the dog, trying really hard not to feel like we were an imposition. But social norms and what time you show up can also vary widely. Question 6. In Egypt, you've been invited to a meal at a family home. Towards the end of the meal, you're very full. Your hostess offers you more food. What should you do? Should you politely refuse? Should you accept and eat everything on your plate? Should you accept and take a small bite? Or should you accept and ask if you can take it home with you? So, anyone willing to guess on that one? Accept and take a small bite. I hear from over here. Other suggestions? Take it home. Accept and take a small bite. So in the Middle East, food is very much a sign of hospitality, and you will always be offered more food. You will always. So for those of us, I grew up in the Clean Plate Club. My parents were like, you should finish everything on your plate. You don't waste things. This I struggled with a little bit on my first Middle East assignment, because you will show up, when I was in the Kurdish region of northern Iraq, there would be 6 of us invited for lunch, and they would have about 20 dishes spread out like a banquet table. And that's the sign of hospitality. They want to be seen to be, kind of overflowing with hospitality towards you, and the first thing you think, like me, is, oh my God, we're never gonna finish all this food. But you don't have to. And in fact, you should always accept a little bit, and when you leave some on your plate, that's a sign that your hostess has actually fed you sufficiently. And that's the polite thing to do. Question 7. While in South Korea for a business meeting, you present a gift to your business associate to thank him for his hospitality and to build the relationship. He refuses to accept the gift. So what should you do? Do you apologize for offending him? Do you insist he takes the gift until he accepts it? Or would you quietly just keep the gift? I hear some C's, I hear some B's. Yeah? Insist he takes the gift until it is accepted. Because actually in South Korea, you're supposed to resist. That is the polite form of receiving a gift in South Korea, you should say, oh, no, no, I don't need it. And so you're supposed to sort of politely keep presenting it to them. Polite persistence is the way we put it. But there, it's good manners to say no. But if you don't know that and you show up and you give someone a gift and they refuse it, I think our instinctive reaction is to be like, oh, I'm sorry, gee, maybe I offended him. No, they are supposed to sort of politely refuse it because that's polite in their culture. Okay, in India, you're invited to a friend's house to share a meal of rice and curry. What's the best way to eat it? A, using a spoon. B, using your left hand only. C, using your right hand only. Or using both hands alternately. Yes. Huh? I hear left hand, I hear right hand. You're supposed to use your right hand only. Because the left hand is considered unclean. Now, clearly, you're going to go to many places around the world. These are generalizations. These are based on sort of traditional. You will go many places where they understand Western culture. You'll be in hotels where there are Western norms are accepted. But that's the more traditional view if you actually travel to India. Question 9. In which country would you expect to see students knock on the surface of the desk after a particularly good presentation? We have Brazil, Uganda, Thailand, or Germany. Any guesses out there? See? You're saying Thailand? Yeah. Germany. In Germany and Austria, in fact, this is considered applause, actually, in the academic context. You won't see that probably outside the academic context, but within it. Last question on this one. In what country is it considered rude to clink your glass of beer in a toast? Thailand, Hungary, Costa Rica, or Zimbabwe? This one stumped some of my foreign service friends, so. Any guesses? Hungary. Yeah, I actually learned that on my first trip to Hungary. Thankfully, someone told me in advance. I don't know that they know for sure why this is that cultural norm, but one legend says that when Hungary's 1848 revolution against Austria was unsuccessful, the Austrians were celebrating by clinking their beer glasses in Vienna. So the Hungarians vowed they would never do that. And it's very interesting, it's considered rude in many countries not to look directly in the eyes of whoever you're clinking with. So sometimes if you're in a group of people, a lot of times as Americans, we'll all kind of put our glasses in the middle and say cheers. But if you're in other countries, like when I've been in the Czech Republic, for example, you're supposed to look the person in the eye as you do each one. And in fact, how they clink can be quite different. One of the things they do in the Czech Republic is they'll clink the top, they'll clink the bottom, put it down, and then drink. So these are the really important things you learn when you're... Right. Yes, so maybe that's okay. So I'm going to talk a little bit about the dimensions of culture, and by that I mean that there's a lot of things that sort of govern our cultures that are on a pole or on a spectrum, and we can be at sort of one end of it, somewhere in the middle, or somewhere at the end. And these are things that it's good to know when you're going to travel around. There are 4 different ones that we see frequently. One is egalitarian culture versus a more hierarchical culture. One is an individual culture versus a more collectivist culture. Cultures that have direct communication versus indirect communication. And cultures that have what we call monochronic time versus polychronic time. So what are these? I actually picked these 4. There's other dimensions, and I'm not a sociologist, but these are things that it's very helpful to know in advance before traveling to a different country or culture, because it really speaks to how people relate to each other. So we'll look at egalitarian or individualism versus collectivism, and you do not have to read all of that dense text on that slide. But I picked these dimensions because the US is very strongly at one end of the spectrum on all of these four. And on this one, individualism versus collectivism, which one do you think the US is? We're a very individualist society. Australia, Netherlands are also very individualistic. And by this we mean people think they have a unique identity, believe in self-expression, kind of following your own path. People are, if you want to seek help or advice, you might seek out a professional to do that. But if you're in a more collectivist culture, there your extended family is really the most important social unit. They have very strong social ties, your cooperation is very key, teamwork is very key, and if you're looking for help or advice, you're going to turn to your family members versus maybe perhaps an outside professional. And so countries with strong collectivism include Japan, South Korea, or Brazil. Egalitarianism versus hierarchy. Again, this is one where the United States is very strongly on a particular end of that spectrum, and that would be egalitarianism, exactly. As is Denmark, as is Finland. By egalitarian, we are self-directed. I believe that I can talk to my boss can talk to me, very frankly, very openly. We tend to be informal. We tend to be more relaxed in our interactions with other people. A lot of different countries, when I go, they're surprised to hear that within the embassy, we call everyone by their first name. My boss is Rick, my subordinate calls me Kim. Like, that is very typical of American culture. There's only one person in an embassy who we don't call by their first name. And do you know who that might be? The ambassador. We always call the ambassador, ambassador. That title, he or she is the personal representative of the president. That is a sign of respect. But basically, the ambassador goes by the name of their title, ambassador or ambassador, whatever their last name is. But everyone else in the embassy is Kim or Joe or Jane or whatever. This is not true in many cultures, and they would actually find it exceedingly different. For example, China, India, Nigeria. These are cultures where there is a very strong sense of hierarchy. Managers make decisions and send it down to lower levels of employees. The employees don't question it in the same manner that we would feel perfectly comfortable doing. And they tend to be more formal cultures, and titles and sort of protocol tends to be a more important element. So when we go to those cultures, we have to adapt and understand how to show that due deference. Yes. Yes. Yep. Very much. So this question, she asked me if in the Middle Eastern countries, if they were more hierarchical. And yes, there's usually, in particular, a sort of strong family person at the top of both the extended family and or the tribe. And in fact, it was interesting when I was in the Kurdish region of northern Iraq. One of our employees was having some difficulty with her family, so she took her personal issue to the head of the consulate there, because that person for her was the person who you are supposed to go to with that kind of problem, because that's the person with stature and authority to help you solve it. Whereas I think a lot of times we're more likely to talk to peers or colleagues in a different manner. So direct versus indirect communication. Again, the US off the charts on terms of direct communication. And this is where that communication flows up and down. We like honest feedback. We like direct feedback. A lot of companies now have what they call 360 references. So if I'm applying for a job in the State Department, they talk to people who I have supervised, they talk to my peers, and they talk to my former bosses. So it's not something that's driven entirely by just, this boss liked me, and then you can move on. And that's unusual. You're not going to see that in a lot of different cultures. Whereas countries with indirect communication include Russia, Japan, or Pakistan. And this is where that concept of saving face comes in. You're not going to directly confront somebody. You're not actually always going to get a straight answer. A lot of times Americans, we go into cultures like Afghanistan or Iraq, and when we ask a yes or no question, a lot of times they'll tell us yes, even if the answer is no. because it is rude to tell somebody no. So we think we've had a conversation, and they've said, yes, we will do that on Tuesday, and we waltz away and we tell Washington, don't worry, they will do this on Tuesday. And then on Tuesday comes, nothing happens. So we go back and we say, I thought we had all agreed that we were going to do this on Tuesday. Oh, yes, yes, yes. We will absolutely do that on Tuesday. But, okay, it didn't work out, so can we do it by Thursday? Yes, no problem, we will do it on Thursday. So we go back. And we tell Washington, hey, no problem, they didn't get it done on Tuesday, but it will happen on Thursday. Thursday rolls around, what happens? Nothing happens. That's how you eventually figure out that the answer is no, because they're not going to tell you no. And we tend to value that, we expect that, but you're just simply not going to find that in all of the different places around the world because it's not culturally done. And then monochronic versus polychronic time, this is just a different way of saying things like punctuality and efficiency are valued. That would be definitely on the US side of the spectrum. And then countries that have a different sense of the fluidity of time. So if you make an appointment at the dentist at 10 o'clock, you're probably going to show up at 10 o'clock at the dentist. And the dentist should be ready for you, you know, pending some surprise that happens. In a polychronic society, you can show up at 10 o'clock and they might be ready to meet you at 11. So there's a much more fluid sense of time, and that is something that is very hard for Americans to adapt to. And again, in some cultures, you get used to drinking a lot of tea while you wait for the importance of, you know, the strong man. And it usually is in those cultures, but in some cultures, making people wait is a sign of your own authority. So it's done deliberately. And, you know, we tend to think of, you know, punctuality. So, as examples, informality in the workplace and comfort disagreeing with superiors, that's egalitarianism or hierarchy. Egalitarianism, right. Avoidance of criticism and only hinting at problems, direct versus indirect communication. Indirect. Consulting your extended family when making important life and career decisions. Yep, exactly. So, I think it's important that we all recognize some of our own American cultural traits. It's kind of hard to see this slide a little bit, but if you were asked by somebody to describe what's important to Americans, what do we think, what would you say? If I asked you just to, you know, describe an average American to me, what we think is important, what are some of the things that you think you would want to convey to someone who's not an American? What do we value? We value freedom. What else? Honesty, hard work ethic, absolutely. Opportunity. Opportunity is very important to Americans. Freedom of speech. Individualism, expressing yourself and kind of charting your own path. So, like I said, this is a little bit hard to read, but some of the things that come up commonly when we've asked, you know, foreigners to describe American is the belief in individuality, respect for meritocracy, that you should be able to work your way up to whatever level that you want to, appreciation for innovation, respect for punctuality. Americans are very punctual. We're also very comfortable with informality. We're generally optimistic. We have a preference for, or a value for, very straightforward answers. And, you know, we believe in people forging their own paths. Those are all things that we see as very positive and that are very important cultural traits for Americans. But as we said at the beginning of this lecture, you know, what's normal in our culture might not be normal in another culture. So in another culture, these traits could translate as you have a diminished sense of community. You know, we're all individuals, we're doing our own thing. Other cultures could read that as, you know, you're not feeding in and helping your entire community in the same way that they would consider valuable and important. A lower obligation to conform to social norms or follow in your parents' footsteps is sometimes seen as selfish in other cultures. Lack of formality and less deference, which we think is, you know, is wonderful because we're very egalitarian. That sometimes comes across as disrespectful. And the American close attention to time, and I don't know how many times we've been told Americans do not know how to relax. We look at our time in certain chunks and we value it very, very, very strongly, but that doesn't always translate in another culture, which views time and the importance of time and the value of time a little differently than what we do. So when we're communicating across cultures, there are things you can be attuned to in order to navigate a little bit more smoothly. Nonverbal communication. This is where we get a lot of the cues that sometimes we don't even realize we're getting, more so than direct questions and answers. But nonverbal cues can actually mean something very different in another culture than what they mean in an American culture. So here's a couple of examples. A head toss. So if someone comes to me and says, I want to find the closest Hy-Vee, is it off to the left? And if I say, no, it's off to the right, and I would kind of indicate that direction with my head, we would understand that you should go that way, right? You should follow the direction of the head toss. But in some Mediterranean countries and across the Middle East, that can mean no. Or in some countries, it can mean yes. So you want to make sure you get your head toss right when you're asking directions in particular. Waving. Common gesture in America, right? Hello, goodbye. In Greece, this is considered a little insulting. You would never think that because it's just so ingrained. You say hello, you say goodbye. Nodding. We think that's a simple one, right? That means yes. But if you're in Greece or Bulgaria, this means no. Right? And this is very interesting. If I give you a thumbs up, what does that mean? Great job. Wonderful. I love what you're doing. This is vulgar and offensive in West Africa. This is the equivalent of you flipping them the middle finger. So certain parts of the world, I would not use the thumbs up. Also, greetings can vary a lot from culture to culture. So, clearly in America, what do? If you meet someone for the first time? You're gonna shake hands, right? If you're in France, someone will kiss you. This took me a little bit to get used to because, I'm from the Midwest and we do not kiss people we do not know. But in France, you will kiss them. It actually comes across as a bit more of a air kiss, so it's a little bit, on each side. The Maori of New Zealand actually will press their foreheads and their noses together. That's a sign of greeting. If you are in India, they'll fold their hands together and say namaste, which literally means like, I bow to you. A very formal Japanese will bow. And bowing can be very important in that culture where if you are considered of less high social stature or younger, you should bow lower than the person who you're bowing to. So there's a lot of unseen signals that take place in that gesture. And in the Middle East, I thought this was actually really nice. In the Middle East, if you are a very strict Muslim, and I am a female, and you are a male, you don't necessarily want to shake my hand or greet me that way because you're not really supposed to touch women who are not in your family. So I always thought this was really nice because the gesture that people would say to me, which would indicate to me that, I am more traditional or I don't want to shake your hand, is they put their hand over their heart. It's a lovely gesture. It means I welcome you, I am happy to meet you. But it also gave me the subliminal signal that I needed, which was don't walk up to him and, cannot wait to meet you. So that was just kind of a minor cultural cue, but I just thought it was a lovely gesture too, putting your hand over your heart when you meet somebody. And we've already talked a little bit about how the concept of time can vary a lot from different cultures. Personal space. This is an interesting one because we all have our concept of personal space, and we don't actually even realize that someone else may have a very different concept of that. And by that, I mean how close you will stand to people in different situations. So, if I can have a volunteer from the audience. And if not, I will pick on Deb McAllister. Because she got me into this. Yes, come on. Right. This is what we call voluntold. So if I'm meeting you for the first time, we will probably stand about this far apart and shake hands. And that's our comfort zone, right? If I really know you, I'll come up, give you a hug, very comfortable doing that. But if you're in another culture, arm's length, particularly, like I said, in the Middle East, particularly in gender roles, they're going to stand much farther away from you. And you have to resist the temptation to move in because you think you're having this great conversation. Other countries and other cultures, for example, Latin America and the Caribbean, are very comfortable getting much closer to you. And what happens if someone comes up here and is talking to you?
Yeah, it's a little close.
Yeah, yeah. So you're going to want to move back, aren't you? And then you move back a step. And then I will follow up. Because I am comfortable speaking to you this close. And then you will back up again. And sometimes you will see people at like dinner parties going like this, kind of scooching away from people. And it all just comes down to what our comfort of personal space is. And we don't even realize that it might be different until someone stands like this next to you. So thank you for volunteering.
And you know what, and what you said, for me, it's been interesting in the tri-faith, different members of the Muslim community what males want to shake my hands and to pay attention to who doesn't want me to touch them has been a real...
Absolutely, and gender norms. Like in the Middle East, two men can stand more comfortably, close together. But if you're a woman and, been a woman in the Middle East, they're going to be much farther away from you. And so you sort of feel like, do I smell? Do I have, something? No, it's just a comfort and a personal space. And then also tone and volume. So if you're an American and you are overseas and you're all out at dinner at a restaurant, do you think Americans are considered quiet? Americans are never considered quiet. In most cultures, we are the exuberant ones. We talk more loudly. When we were in France, I was always relieved if a table of Italians would come in because they would talk louder than we would. Very loud, very exuberant. But a lot of French believe if you're in a restaurant and it's a nice, restaurant and a nice dining atmosphere, you're supposed to talk in a more subdued tone, and the people at the next table shouldn't hear you. So you can see people having this big, loud conversation, and you might think if you don't speak the language, wow, they're really going at it. And they could be talking about gardening or the weather if that is the cultural norm in that country in terms of tone and volume. Okay, last I'm going to talk a little bit about cultural taboos, because every culture has its unseen, cultural taboos, things you shouldn't do. A lot of them are linked to sometimes religion or holidays or different traditions. So, in what country should you avoid wearing white clothing to a celebration or using white paper to wrap a gift? You have Bolivia, China, Malawi, or Turkey. Okay, I hear a couple people saying China. Anyone know why? Yeah, again, that's traditionally the color of mourning. So if we see a group of people all dressed in black, what do we think? It's mourning, or they're going to a rock concert. But in China, they would all be wearing white. Here's another one. In what countries can tipping be seen as offensive? Italy and Croatia, Mexico and Honduras, Qatar and Saudi Arabia, or Japan and South Korea? And by the way, everyone in the world thinks Americans tip more than anybody else. We tip more generously. I have certainly had friends who are like Canadian or New Zealand say, "You're ruining it for the rest of us, just stop." The answer is Japan and South Korea. And, again, these are all sort of generalizations, and you're going to travel places where they know it's a tourist zone and Americans have ruined it for everybody and tipped. But there, the work is seen as being very tied to your self-worth, and tipping someone for doing their job and their worth could be seen as depreciating that. Okay, in what region is it derogatory to call someone over to you by this gesture, by making your kind of curling your finger at them? Where would that be considered derogatory? You have a choice of Asia, Central America, Europe, or the Middle East. Yeah, this one comes as a surprise to a lot of people. It's in Asia. This is considered derogatory, and in fact, in Thailand, this is how they call dogs. So you don't want to say, oh, excuse me, can you come over here? If you're in Thailand, would not be the way to do it. And so again, this is something that can be such a habitual gesture, you don't think anything of it, and it has a completely different connotation in a different society. Okay, let's see. Okay, in many Muslim, Hindu, and Buddhist countries, why should people be careful when crossing their legs? Oops. I already gave it away. It's because showing the sole of your foot can be seen as disrespectful. So if you're going to cross your legs, you want to be careful about where you are showing the sole of your foot, because the sole of your foot has contact with the ground. It's considered unclean. Yeah, exactly. And that's something that, you know, I sit habitually with my legs crossed. It's very hard for me to think about where I need to direct it. Okay, in which country is it considered greedy to open a gift in front of the person who gives it to you? Now, this is actually very common in America, right? Someone will give you a gift, you say, oh, this is lovely, you open it and express appreciation. But it can be considered greedy in either Australia, India, Namibia, or Peru. Best guess? I hear a few Indias out there, you are right. It can be seen as looking greedy. So you should not in India naturally expect if you give a gift to someone that they will actually open it, but they will do it after you're gone. Okay. Where might you be judged for asking for condiments or other seasoning if it's not already in front of you on the table? China, Czech Republic, Italy, or Russia? Yeah, everybody kind of jumps to Italy on that one, and that's true. That can be considered, it's rude to the chef who has prepared the food if he has not already put it out on the table. Okay, in what country is it poor taste to refuse to eat the sheep's eye? You have a choice of Kazakhstan, Egypt, Saudi Arabia, or Scotland. I hear different things coming out. Yep. So in Saudi Arabia, sheep's eyes are considered a delicacy and are usually offered to the guest in the position of honor. So definitely remember that. So this basically covers sort of the framework of what I wanted to discuss to give you some food for thought on things that you may want to think of while traveling, may want to be aware of. I'm also very happy at this time to do some question and answer. If you would like to know more about what it's like to be a diplomat or have any questions about anything I've covered, you're very welcome to ask. So.
Region where you could find out. Oh, I'm sorry.
Yeah, go ahead.
I was just asking if the State Department or the government has a resource that you could go and look at if you were planning on traveling to a particular country or countries so that you could better inform yourself in a reliable way.
Absolutely, and that is a great question. And the answer to that is yes. In fact, where I am now assigned, I'm on a 2-year domestic assignment at the Foreign Service Institute. And we are the training institute for foreign affairs professionals across the U.S. government. So whether you work for, Treasury, if you're a diplomat, if you work for Foreign Agricultural Service, we have a bunch of resources. We have in-classroom training. We have area studies training if you're going to certain geographic regions. That's usually part of language training. We will train people. We are very well known for training people in languages that not everyone around the world speaks. So if you are assigned to Bulgaria, we will teach you Bulgarian. It's a 10-month training course, and as part of that, you will also have sessions on like the country, the culture, regional, political, and economic issues, so that when you arrive at post, you're actually well informed. We've also started launching more distance learning, so we have some computer-based online courses that people sign up for if they're U.S. government employees, and we have what we call an overseas briefing center, where people can go and find different materials. So we make quite a big effort to inform people before they go out to a different assignment in a different country, to give them a chance to know more about the culture, the language, and things that they need to be aware of. So, great question. Other questions in the back?
Wait. We have online people who can't hear if we don't.
Sure.
Does the State Department put anything out for travelers, the do's and don'ts for different areas?
Yes, and in fact, you can go to the State Department website. We have travel information for every country where we've got an embassy, including some where we don't, that actually tells you things about, like, do you need to worry about security, the types of things that you might, confront there. We have travelers' notes. We've got, profiles. So yes, we actually have a lot of information. The primary mission of actually embassies overseas, how many of you know? If you had to guess what the primary mission of what we do is, do you know? It's keeping Americans safe. Actually, it's keeping Americans safe overseas. That's our primary mission. We exist there to provide services to American citizens. Then, of course, the cultural liaison and everything with the country and the host government helps us to advance U.S. interests there. So in my job, I'm what's called a political officer. And if the United States is going to have a vote in the UN, me or someone on my team will go to the Ministry of Foreign Affairs in the country where I'm posted, and we'll say, there's going to be a vote in the UN on Thursday, and we want you to vote yes. And this is why. And then they will answer, yes, we agree with you. No, we don't agree with you. Or, we might be able to agree with you, but we need X, Y, or Z as well. And then we will negotiate with them a little bit. We will take it back. We'll send instructions to Washington saying, okay, country X may be on board with us. These are some of the things they think they need. And then we'll provide our own analysis. We understand that this direction is probably coming from the Prime Minister's office. If we can get him on board, we might be able to get what we need, from this country. So we sort of serve as a liaison of issues that are important to the U.S. And our strategic interests. But we have a whole division within every embassy called our consular division, and a key component of that is American Citizen Services. And they deal with everything from an American dies overseas, Americans get thrown in prison overseas, Americans lose their passports overseas. Sometimes you have Americans who are overseas who become destitute for one reason or another. We help assist in getting them back to the States. If there is a volcano, a hurricane, or whatever, we coordinate some of the emergency response for the U.S. government. So really one of our primary missions is actually to support Americans who are overseas.
About being a diplomat. If you could just comment about the diplomat's relationship with the country they're in. And every embassy I've seen is surrounded with razor wire. I hear the diplomats and the staff all stay inside. They don't get out. They party with each other. They don't want anybody coming in. I mean, I think travelers are in the community, but am I correct that the staff pretty much stays with other Americans and does not get out, doesn't mingle, doesn't date anybody? Are you basically, to be part of the community, or are you there just to take care of Americans and not be in the community?
Yeah, we actually do both. The level of security actually depends on the country that you're in. I've been in Afghanistan, I've been in Iraq. Their security is a really big issue, but I could still get out. It has to be coordinated. We have certain security protocols. I would say, particularly since Benghazi happened, nobody wants to lose, diplomats overseas. Nobody wants them to become a target. So we have a lot of security protocols and a lot of things that are developed and procedures to keep us safe, but our mission is actually to get out. You know, I can't do my job sitting in the embassy. I have to go and speak to the host government. In many places, even in Afghanistan, I would go to people's houses, and you know, you learn a lot more in some of those informal exchanges than you do in sort of official business settings. Many countries you can actually move around much more comfortably than you can in really what we call high threat posts or high security posts. So in those posts, you have to figure out what your workarounds are, and you find different ways to get out, you know, including, you know, we would even do things with, you know, Skype or whatever in Afghanistan. If we couldn't get to a school because, you know, something happened on the road, you know, that day and we couldn't get out, you know, we could Skype with students. We would set up stuff. Sometimes the infrastructure of the country doesn't lend that self always, but that is one option. But if we're not talking to them and if they're not talking to us, we are a far less useful resource for all of you, because what we're supposed to do, like in my job, is try to explain the host government to Washington and try to explain Washington's views to the host government with the objective of advancing, you know, U.S. interests. If we've got interests and things we want to do, we're only going to get there by talking, and you cannot replace a diplomat with an internet terminal. Like, someone in Washington cannot just send an email to someone in a foreign country and expect to get a result. That's not really how that's built on. So we need a certain amount of face-to-face time, and we get out and we do that. Most countries, we also live on the local culture. We're not on a compound behind barbed wire. We live in communities. You know, I've had apartments or, you know, places like that. That's not true in Afghanistan. That's not true in Iraq. You know, it's not true in South Sudan. But most countries, we actually do live on the local economy. We shop on the local economy. And that's a very important element of what we do, and it helps us to understand the culture and what's happening there. I used to tell people when, you know, elections are coming up, one of the things that I do is, you know, I'm an election junkie. We follow the elections. You know, who's going to be the next president of France? Like, that's important. And you know, some of the best people to talk to are taxi drivers. They drive around all day and talk to people. So if you're taking local taxis and stuff like that around, you get a lot of useful information about, oh yeah, no one cares about, all you know, you diplomats, you all think that we care about this, but actually what everyone's really worried about is that. And it, you know, we can all spend a certain time with a bunch of, you know, the educated elites, but you need to talk to everybody to really understand the country more broadly. So we actually do get out a lot more than I think the stereotype is, and I would say in some countries, yes, it's much more difficult and we have to figure out how to do it. But most countries, we actually do get out, and that's important.
I'm curious about places that you've observed religious conflict or religious harmony, and I really don't know how many of your placements have been monolithic religious cultures. So that's a big question.
Yeah, I mean, I would have to say, I mean, clearly there is conflict, you know, ongoing in Afghanistan. That's more between the more fundamentalist versus the more moderate views. Most of the places that I have been are not, usually have a kind of a majority dominant religion or majority dominant, you know, ethnic population. So one of the things that we actually kind of monitor is how do they treat the religious minority or the ethnic minority, and we spend a lot of time interacting with host governments in order to ensure that if you're a Christian in Iraq, you know, for example, like what are they doing to protect the rights of, you know, Christians and the safety and security there. If you are, you know, I name that religion, you know, in Haiti, where there's a lot of fundamentalist or voodoo-related religion is one underpinning, but there's also a lot of Christianity, and some of it's kind of fused. We deal with a lot of, you know, missionaries who are there, you know, trying to do good work and that kind of thing. So one of the things that we do monitor is how countries treat their religious and ethnic minorities, and that's part of our conversation with a lot of countries. But I personally haven't been in a country like perhaps like Lebanon, where there's divisions are much more clear, and that kind of conflict is simmering a little bit, you know, kind of beneath the surface, more so. Mm-hmm.
I understand under President Obama's administration that there was a significant effort from the White House Faith-Based Office to set out a series of standards from the President's Advisory Council about the relationship to religions and trying to help understand religions. There was a significant increase in the State Department to a whole division being created, essentially, that had 40 staff persons, and that there was a series of recommendations that were meant to be implemented through the State Department and through all missions around the world about increasing religious sensitivity training and so forth. I'm wondering about how that looked from your perspective on the ground, and if you were asked in the type of training that you're providing and so forth to include more significant religious elements to what it is that you were doing to increase sensitivity.
Yep. And absolutely, that's a very good question, and that's an issue that actually the U.S. Congress is very interested in, and we have certain, members of Congress. So in the Wolf Amendment, Frank Wolf, who is a leading congressman on religious issues, they passed a law last year that actually implemented some required training that we are now doing in the State Department. So we already offered, and my division specifically offers, training on, human rights, democracy promotion, religious freedom, and the elements of U.S. policy of religious freedom. But we've also incorporated now a mandatory training requirement for all incoming diplomats, have specific sessions on this as part of their orientation training. We do another training for all new chiefs of mission, which are ambassador level, and deputy chiefs of mission, number 1 and number 2 at our embassy, where, again, these elements of what, U.S. policy is, what we can do, what are our resources, that's a mandatory training. And we're in the process of standing up an online training course that's going to become mandatory by the end of this year for all diplomats worldwide to actually take some additional training on this. So this is something that's a very important part of American policy. It has been for many years, the questions of, religious freedom and, like I said, religious tolerance, religious minorities, and so I think one of the things that the increased training and everything is designed to do is to make sure that everyone's aware of what we can do, what are resources we can pull from. We have a division in our democracy, human rights, and labor. We have a religious freedom division that specifically follows these issues. Every embassy in the world will do an annual report on human rights and an annual report on international religious freedom on that specific country. So what's going on in Saudi Arabia, what's going on in Bulgaria, what's going on in Honduras. So these are really important and enduring elements of U.S. foreign policy that I think we are continuing to highlight and continuing to increase the training of diplomats who are going overseas to, who help to, monitor and, work on some of these questions, which can be, quite difficult questions in different countries. Absolutely.
If I may just ask a second question, is your training that you do from the State Department for foreign missions and so forth related in any way to any of the military training? One example is that I understand the Al-Amani Center, which was created by the Reformed Church of the United States in Oman, it has had for a long time a contract with the U.S. government to train all military leadership and personnel that are to go to the Afghanistan amphitheater where you were in a point of service. And part of that was a similar type of cultural and religious training such as what you're providing. Is there any sense of coordination between those two things or no?
Yeah, we have, I would say on that specifically, that's a little outside of my bailiwick, so I don't know exactly what kind of programs are. But we, for example, in my training division, we have a military officer who is the liaison to the Foreign Service Institute writ large that's designed to increase the cooperation between diplomats and the military. Clearly, the military does things on a much vaster scale. There's a lot more of them. And there's a lot more of them who are deployed. So they have any number of initiatives, but this kind of cultural training and religious training to increase the awareness of troops, particularly if they're going to be deployed in places where the cultural norms are very different, has become very important for the military. I have actually been invited to go out in September to Monterey to talk to the incoming Air Force Foreign Area Officers. These are people who will be deployed overseas and in U.S. embassies to teach them a little bit about what the State Department does, what we do as diplomats, and how we can work together. So I think there's a lot of increased initiatives, but there's a little bit of a difference of scale because they are so much bigger than we are. But we are certainly, I think, have a number of different initiatives that are ongoing at any given point in time where we're trying to work more closely with our military colleagues on these issues, which are really common to both of our missions.
Just a simple question. Do you learn the language of all the countries that you go to?
Almost all of them. There's a few assignments where you're not, but we actually have language training on a scale that, you know, most countries don't have. If you are going to go to a Spanish-speaking country, you will do full-time language training for about 6 months. If you're going to go to a language like Germany or Serbian or Ukrainian, it's about a 10-month language training. And again, this is like 9 to 5 every day with homework. If you are going to an Arabic-speaking country, we actually have 2 years of language training. You will do 1 year in Washington and 1 year in an Arabic-speaking country. We do the same for Chinese, Korean, Japanese, what we call, those are the really hard languages, but there's 2 years of training before you start your assignment. Now, generally, if you have one of those or you have learned one of those, you'll probably go back more than once. So we have Japanists, for example, who've served more than one time in Japan. If you're an Arabic speaker, you know, there's a number of countries where you can serve. I speak Czech, so I've actually been twice in the Czech Republic. That's a little bit of, you know, making use of the assets you already have instead of training someone else in a language if you have someone who's already available. But we have language training on, we'll teach you Tagalog if you're going to the Philippines. So we train, including in, when the former Soviet Union broke up, you know, we used to just train everybody in Russian, but now we actually train them in Uzbek or Ukrainian or Tajikistan, you know, Tajik. So we have very ambitious, and we are expected to, when we get to that country, you know, we will test at a certain level, and then we are expected to be able to use it at a professional level from the moment we get there. We also have ongoing language training in some of our posts to help people even increase their language to a higher level. So language training is a huge part of what we do, and the U.S. is actually seen as being, you know, very effective in that respect. Smaller countries, smaller diplomatic corps don't have the resources to do that. So a lot of them will learn maybe English, or they use English or French, or, you know, as a diplomatic language in different countries. We actually, the fact that we make that effort to learn the local language gives us an entree, you know, into the society that you don't have. I have to say, it was very weird for me when I went to, I was in the Kurdish region of northern Iraq, and that was just a 1-year assignment. So they didn't train me for a year in the language before I went there, but it's very disconcerting as a diplomat. I'm used to watching the news, reading the paper, doing everything in the local language, and to actually go somewhere where you don't have that resource is disconcerting. But in those places where we don't have the resources, or not all positions are language designated, some might be language designated to learn Kurdish, some might not. We have translators, we have interpreters, I get news summaries, and, you know, so we do a lot of things to make sure we have access to the information we need, but it is a very different experience if you don't actually have the local language. And so I always, you know, prefer to have the local language if I can, and we do it most places. Another question?
I have not had any. I'm not sure. Can you hear me?
Yeah.
Okay. Doesn't have any feedback. All right. Anyway, I am very concerned about a third of our family being Muslim, and I don't know what the rules are.
Okay.
Could you give us a brief crash course, the Cliff Notes?
Well, I mean, I do have to say, you know, Muslim is a big catch-all word, right? Because they could be Sunni Muslim, they could be Shia Muslim, they could be, you know, Faili Shia Muslim, they could be Hanafi. There's kind of different sects, and there's going to be sort of different rules of how you know, might operate in that culture. So a crash course in being a Muslim would be a little hard to come up with a sufficient of a generalization, because just like in America, a evangelical Christian is maybe going to approach things very different than a, you know, reformed Christian might do. So, right.
There it this again, to offend anyone. And I speak for a living. Okay, and I forget the microphone. Okay. But anything that you could tell us about, you said how much, we don't want to see the sole of your shoes in a certain place in the world, and we don't want to this. If you could give us any clues about that, I would be grateful.
Yeah, I think one of the things is that you definitely want to do, go, yeah.
There's a really good book called How to Be a Perfect Stranger. It's by Skylight Press, and it helps you to understand how to interact with people of various different religions, but it will have a small section on Judaism, on Islam, and it gives you basics about how you greet someone, what it would mean to go to a funeral, what it would mean to go to a wedding, what if you have somebody in your home, what some of the things are that you might give as consideration, and it gives broad answers for various different types of Muslims. How to Be a Perfect Stranger. It's by Skylight Press.
Well, see, that's a great recommendation. And I would also say, don't hesitate to ask questions. A lot of people find it, it's very flattering. People love the fact that you are interested and want to learn. So you should never hesitate to ask questions. Say, I don't know a lot about, the culture. If there are certain things or certain traditions in your family, I would love to, know more about them. Like I said, in the Middle East and in, Muslim culture, things like hospitality is very important, relationship building, taking the time to know and build those relationships. I think just like everywhere though, people know you're trying, and if they actually know you're trying, even if you commit little faux pas, here and there, they'll forgive you, just like we would forgive someone, who's coming to our culture. Or if someone comes for Thanksgiving dinner the first time, you're not gonna, take offense at minor things that people might do. So I would say if they are more traditional family, that's things like where you should expect there will be more gender separation than what you might be used to, in America, even including, the women can all go off and sit in one place and the men in the other. Interestingly, like for me as a diplomat in those cultures, a lot of times the women are considered like, they call it the third sex, we're like the third gender, because I do things that a woman in their own local culture wouldn't do. But it's acceptable because I am a Western woman and they know that. So, I would go to dinner with, me. There's not always a lot of women in some of the environments that I've been in. So, I sometimes in meetings or whatever, it'd be me and 17 men sitting around a table. So, but I represent the U.S. I represent, what we stand for and the egalitarian and gender equality, and they totally would accept that from us. They've had enough contact with us, and so I was treated, I think, differently than if I was a local female sitting in that meeting. So you get a little bit, different treatment that can come out that way. But I would say just don't hesitate to ask. Be aware of perhaps gender roles, traditional gender roles. Be aware of the importance of hospitality and relationships. And beyond that, ask them what their traditions and what their comfort zone is on things. Most people will take it very, very well. One last question.
I have two questions. First of all,
two last questions.
What enticed you to get into the Foreign Service?
Mm-hmm.
And secondly, the fact that they move people every 2 to 3 years and they have to go back and train them on that current language. How do you feel about the cost effectiveness as opposed to leaving people in these locations a longer period of time?
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Two very good questions. I would say I actually kind of fell into the Foreign Service a little bit by chance. I had studied in France in the 80s, before internet. And I knew at that point I wanted to do something with an international angle to it, but I didn't really know what that was. And then I went out to Washington, D.C. for law school. And when I was out in law school, and this was the 90s, and the economy wasn't really strong on hiring lots of too many lawyers in Washington, D.C. So some friends and I were talking, and one said, we should take the Foreign Service exam. And that's the entrance to joining the U.S. Diplomatic Corps. And I said, oh, that's interesting. What is it? I didn't know. And she said, oh, you can work overseas in embassies. It'll be fun. And I said, well, but the deadline is like tomorrow, and I didn't know about this. And she said, don't worry about it. I filled out the application for you. And I said, oh, well, what do I have to do? And she goes, oh, you just, we'll show up, we'll take the exam. It's, 2 Saturdays from now or whatever. And don't worry, it's free. Well, as a law student, anything that's free you sign up for. So off we go. I take the Foreign Service exam and passed. And so then there's a second tranche with an oral exam, and then you have to get a medical clearance and a security clearance. And it kind of came down to, at that point, I was interviewing for a couple of law jobs, including one in New York City with a big law firm, and the Foreign Service, the State Department called me and said, we'd like to offer you a position. And I was like, wow, I wasn't really sure. I had spent all this time and effort and money, trying to become a lawyer, but the international angle sounded really exciting, but I didn't really know what they did. And eventually I kind of just decided that I might as well try the Foreign Service, because if I don't like it, in a year or two, I can go back and be a lawyer. Like, there's nothing cutting that off. Whereas if I had gone ahead with the lawyer job, if I wanted to join the Foreign Service after a couple of years, I was going to have to do this whole process again. Take the written exam, take the oral exam, take the medical, take the security. So I actually kind of went, well, it makes more sense to try this first. And what do you know? It ended up being a great fit. I love it. It's been a wonderful job. Everyone always asks about my friend who made me take it, and no, she didn't pass the Foreign Service exam. But we are good friends to this day. I'm godmother to one of her children. She actually got married, had 3 kids, never left the United States. And I have moved 14 times in 24 years to all these countries around the world. But it's ended up being I like the lifestyle. For me, the moving is worth it. I tell people the Foreign Service or diplomacy is a great career for people with short attention spans. I think anything is exciting for like 2 years, and then you move on to the next shiny object. But I like moving. I like living in the different cultures. I enjoy traveling. That to me is something else I enjoy, but I like having the longer term perspective of actually living in a country, improving your language skills in that country, and you have just a culturally completely different experience out of it. So for me, the constant moving and the fact that they always, break some piece of furniture or something, it's worth it. It's worth it. I've enjoyed it, and I've gone places, occasionally my mom says, why did you raise your hand for that one? You're gonna go where? But, sometimes the places that you go to that you might not go to as a tourist end up being the most exciting places, because you have a window on a world that you hear about on TV or that you see in the news coverage, and this gives me a chance and an opportunity to experience it that I wouldn't have if I was, just a tourist trying to travel around. So for me, it's been a great experience. I love it. I'm continuing to do it. So for right now, I'm in Washington, but at some point I will probably be somewhere else, and my mother will say, "You're going where?" But it's been great.
Can I have you all join me in thanking Kimberly for being with us tonight?
So,
yeah, thank you very much.
Well, thank you, everyone. You've been a great audience. We weren't sure what we would get. I was like, well, it's August, and people are on vacation and stuff, but it's been great. It's great to see some friendly faces and old friends here in the audience. And like I said, it's special for me to come back to Countryside.
Yeah, excellent to have you here. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
I will let you go out and go ahead and get started and grab something to drink or some cookies in the coffee house, and we'll send people out to join you. For the rest of you, as she's exiting, I'd like you to see these cards that are inside each of your little bulletin and programs for tonight. These are evaluation cards that we will use to improve what we do through Center for Faith Studies. So any comments or concerns that you have, whether you had trouble online getting tickets or whether you'd like other kinds of options, any suggestions for speakers or topics, any of those kinds of things, we'd love to hear from you. So if you will take the time to fill out this card, there's a basket on the information station there. As you exit, you can drop it in those baskets on your way out to have coffee and cookies. And again, thanks again for all the volunteers who are with us tonight. They're the ones wearing the blue badges, the blue ribbons on their badges. So if you would say a personal thank you to them, that would be wonderful too. And we're so happy to have you with us. We hope that you'll join us again on September 27th for Joe Storita. Good night. Have some cookies and coffee on us.